that if you haven't snagged your, this is not an advent calendar, full Monty yet. We still have less than a dozen left. 330 plus GST, 5 tastings, 5 whiskeys each. Each of them has a whiskey between 20 and 25 years of age. It's an incredible set. The first 3 days are live on our Instagram, so you can see what we're going to be pouring in those tastings. That's coming up. But James, there is also, you and I have at least one more gathering before Christmas, and there's spots left for this. We have an epic Ben Romick tasting, which, to be fair, we've done a few of these, although I think this is the most epic of them. And there's some spots left for it. It has not one, not two, but 3 roughly 40-year-old Ben Romicks in it.
Wow.
So there's still 10 spots left for that. I know it's not an inexpensive tasting, but that's below cost. We're just trying to recover costs from the rare and old weekend.
Yeah, I may have tried that Ben Romick 1982 in Banff last weekend. Someone had
Oh,
it there as a bottle they brought up, and yeah, that's
wow.
worth the price of admission alone.
There you go. And those 240s are no slouches. Plus, those early 2000s Ben Romick casks that taste like Brora. Pretty crazy. The one last thing I'll mention about the tasting schedule is we have some new events to put up. January, February, that will be out. I want to say tomorrow, but it might be Thursday or Friday. Things are busy right now. It's hard to get the newsletter done. But the tasting schedule's in there. They'll all be in the Malt Messenger. And are these 8-year, as mentioned, or 9-year per the labels? James, my staff, I gave them the bottles. They created labels and emails. Are they 8-year-olds or are they 9-year-olds?
I don't know. This reminds me of that like physics problem where you say if you go a half and then keep going a half towards from one number to the next, do you ever actually get there, or does it just infinitely kind of
Mm-hmm.
sit in between the two? Can I answer it that way?
Yeah. Well, the good
I,
news
I
is
think they're nines officially.
they're all 9-year-olds.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah,
good
and is
news
there
is
whiskey over 9 years old in some of these? Maybe.
probably decent chance. But yeah, that's the good news is so Tom, we're good. There's some confusion, but they're all 9-year-olds. They're young sherried whiskeys. That's the most
They're all
important.
bottled as 9 year olds.
All bottled. There you go. There's some wise words there. Because as everyone knows, you only have to declare the age of the youngest component, and you can
Or an
put
age younger than the
and
youngest component.
you can put an age on there that's younger than the youngest component. That's true. But how dare you disclose the age of all the components if you have the audacity to make a really cool blend? How dare you, sir? We don't need to go down that rabbit hole tonight.
Yeah.
So James, GlenAllachie, we've done a few tastings with GlenAllachie before. This one is the first time I've tried these 9-year-old sherry casks, so I'm excited to do
Yeah,
it.
me as well.
And then the back end, we've got an old school 12-year-old. Uh, I think originally you and I, and this is maybe where some lost in translation, had discussed the possibility of doing a modern 12 as well, but then I don't know if we passed on that or what.
Well, I think we did because we just decided kind of seven was enough and that the 15 and the 18 kind of tell that story.
Mhm. And there's some of that around now, whereas maybe there hasn't been as much in recent years.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
all right, maybe I don't know. Do we want to do a bit of a lead in on like the Coles Notes version of GlenAllachie before we get rolling here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, essentially it's a story of a gentleman named Billy Walker, who I'm guessing many people know from one way, shape, or form. He started way back in the 70s, worked his way up, was working in the blending labs at Ballantyne's, which of course is part of Chivas, and then went on to a career with a few different stops. Kind of probably his first stop where he was known as a producer was when he worked for Burn Stewart, and he was responsible for the revival of Deanston. And then he kind of flipped that experience into convincing Chivas Two Brothers, his old alma mater, to basically sell him one of their distilleries that they felt was redundant. Yeah, this video is great. Um, so yeah, this is GlenAllachie Distillery. It was built in the 60s. I think kind of the Coles notes, the easy way to understand GlenAllachie was it was kind of built as a backup in a way to Aberlour, which was becoming popular as a single malt, but was an important component in a lot of blended scotches. So there was kind of a belief that it needed to be backfilled a little bit with some additional product.
Hmm.
Shares a water source with Ben Rinnes, which is just behind it up the hill. So there's kind of these three distilleries, like Aberlour's at the bottom of the hill, GlenAllachie's kind of halfway up, and Ben Rinnes is at the kind of the base of Ben Rinnes Mountains. So yeah, produces a very kind of fruity and upfront spirit. So very different than Billy's work at his last stop, which of course after Benrique was Glendronach and Glenglassaugh. But yeah, believe it or not, Andrew, when GlenAllachie was purchased, which I almost got Stephen Rankin last week to divulge the selling price, but I, of course, wouldn't put that on a recording. Um,
No.
but that was a very interesting conversation. But yeah, so when GlenAllachie came out and they came and they introduced it to our team, I'm not even joking, Andrew. Their whole first slide was this time around, it's not about Billy. That's what it said. They're gonna try to make this all just about the whiskey and the whole GlenAllachie story. And I think that lasted about 30 seconds.
Well, the
So
legend sells, right? And people, that
yes.
name carries weight, uh, and it's kind of hard to hide from that.
Well, I think what happened too is that as they discovered and kind of GlenAllachie evolved, because even though it's this series of sherry bombs now, like I actually do believe that was not necessarily the intention when they started.
No. Well, I
I think
think,
what they discovered is that when they took a lot of these whiskeys that were very lightly wooded and in like, old refill wood, which they inherited 25,000 casks, almost all of it got recast.
mhm,
But when they put it in these Oloroso and PX sherry casks that come from Miguel Martin, and what came out was just these like absolute fruit bombs slash sherry bombs, and everybody loved it.
mhm.
And it's different than Glendronach, even though the casks are the same. And they've kind of just ran with it, which, I mean, so it kind of ended up becoming like Billy's what he's known for is what worked at GlenAllachie. So yeah, he's kind of a victim of his own success, I guess.
So, but James, I think one of the other stories that's interesting, and it's kind of where we're going to end off on, is not necessarily what they acquired and what they re-racked, but it's what they've done since they took it over.
Yeah,
And I mean, we won't start seeing the fruits of this for at least another year or two, maybe slightly more
yeah.
on the unpeated side.
Well, yeah, I was going to say on the peated side we kind of are seeing it, but
Mhm.
you're right on the unpeated side we're still like 3 or 4 years away.
And what that's going to be is these extremely long fermentation, slow distillation whiskeys
Mhm.
that's going to kind of rewrite the style and the name of GlenAllachie, like what
Yeah.
GlenAllachie is.
Yeah, I
And
think you're
so,
right. I know when I was there last summer and I asked Ronan is very much Billy's protege, who of course formerly of Springbank. And that was my question for him is like, how are the casks of the new make that you made coming along? And like he was legitimately excited. He's like, it's kind of like a more GlenAllachie version of GlenAllachie that is what they're expecting to come down the pipe. So,
mhm,
which is great.
it is something to look forward to. All right, James, we've got seven whiskeys,
Yes.
six of them unpeated.
Yes.
And we're starting off with the Sherry Series. So I'm going to
Yes.
put them up on here.
So I
This,
think like in general, people can probably explore these first three, the Fino and Amontillado and Oloroso, do them in order, but you can kind of go back and forth and get into them all kind of right away. So yeah, spoiler alert, this is the first three in a series of six. And yeah, GlenAllachie clearly in this case sourced specifically the six different types of sherry casks. And the first set is kind of exploring kind of the more classic and well-known types of sherry, which are Fino, Amontillado, and Oloroso.
mhm,
So I think Fino is interesting. So Fino is not, I don't think, a sherry that people think of when they think of whiskey and sherry. So specifically, Fino is really, if you drank Fino, I'm gonna guess a lot of people here maybe have never had Fino before. If someone put a glass of Fino in front of you and you didn't know, you would think it was a dry white wine, that had just been poorly made.
Extremely oxidized, I think would be the other
Yeah,
part.
like you basically it is a white wine that is created and then fortified, but as part of the production process, an actual something called floor, which is this layer that forms on the top of the wine and prevents it from oxidizing. So you still get this like light wine, but the floor imparts a lot of flavor, and it can be a little bit musty. It can be a little bit kind of in that mushroomy kind of character. But the wine itself doesn't really ever oxidize. So all the flavors we're used to with sherry cask, which are the dried fruit and the spice, you
Mhm.
should not expect to get those flavors in here.
No. But the interesting thing is and they talk about this a lot, which is that it's not really the wine. The wine is a part of it, but it's how the wine seasons the cask more than the wine itself that dictates the flavors that follow. And I
Yeah.
think you're right, because if you were to compare, like, I think Cavalan's the easiest example for people to who've really tried a lot of whiskeys to see this, because in their single cask range, they've got, Oloroso sherry, they've got Fino, and you can see the difference between the two. The Fino is a little lighter. It tends to show underlying tropical notes, I think, a little better
Yes.
than Oloroso or Manzanilla does. But yeah, it's still got that richness that you'd expect from a sherry seasoned cask. It's just a little different. I love James. For me, I didn't get Fino for the longest time. I hated it because it's so dry, but it's really the sort of wine you need to have in specific occasions. And
Yeah, like if you're in Spain, especially in the south where it's hot, and a glass of Fino comes out with a plate of like Iberico, like
Mhm.
the dried cured ham, and it's hot out and you've got this cold Fino and it's like the light bulb goes off, right? But
Yeah,
you can't transplant that into like the winter in Calgary. It just doesn't
no.
work that way.
So the second time I tried Fino was in Jerez and in those conditions, and I got it. But the first time I tried it where it clicked, I was in London in a 300-year-old sherry bar with Sam and Dave from Boutique Whiskey, and we drank between the three of us a bottle of Fino and like these
Right.
basically olives, cheese, and dried fruit.
Yep.
And it
Yeah,
was a hot day
perfect.
in London, and it was so refreshing.
Yep. The yeah, something to keep in mind, sherry was the best-selling alcoholic beverage in the world for I think almost 70 years.
Mhm.
And clearly that's not the case anymore, but you have to think Fino would have been one of those top sellers because when you would ship it, that floor would protect the wine from oxidizing even in shipment.
Mhm.
And that's pretty powerful, right? When of course historically, like preserving wine, especially in shipping,
Mhm.
was a challenge.
So nosing it, it definitely, comparing it to the Amontillado is a little nuttier. The Oloroso seems a little darker, a little richer. Um,
Yeah.
but there's similarities. Like they're not drastically day and night different
No.
from each other.
No, which like I always think Amontillado, of course, is essentially a Fino that is allowed to go to the point where the floor dies, and then the oxidation happens afterwards. So you kind of get the Fino character, and it's almost like a halfway between Oloroso and Fino. Um, yeah, what I noticed about this Fino in particular, and you kind of see this through all three of them, is like GlenAllachie Spirit really does shine through even with heavy sherry cask
Mhm.
use. Like that front of the palate, tons of fruit. Like Sammy's note is actually like perfect. Like there's a bit of funk, tiny bit of
Mhm.
sour. It's like that's exactly what this is.
It's a nice
And it does
balance.
showcase the pheno.
It's an not overly sweet or MSG'd North American Chinese food buffet.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. I don't disagree.
The dryness does come through on the palate, I find, the more you get into it.
Yeah.
Do you see those like really drying, warm? Um,
Yeah.
but yeah,
It
it's
does
lovely.
it does taste older than 9 years old.
It does.
Yeah.
Well, James, but here's an interesting, thought on this. We know these were finished, but we don't
Oh
know
yeah.
for how long. So
No.
9 years. GlenAllachie's been run by Billy Walker now for what? 8? Close to 8 years?
No, oh yeah, good question. No, 6.
6 years? It's gotta be more than 6 years.
It was summer of well, it is over 6. It was the summer of 2018.
Okay, there you go. So six and change.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it's got a lovely profile to it. I mean, it's sad that these, were so limited because uh yeah, the profile on it is lovely. But I guess part of that too is, we and even with a distillery like GlenAllachie, there's been a like not want to say exponential, there's been an expansion of its range. And,
Yeah.
you know, whereas 2, 3 years ago, you couldn't keep 12, 15, 18 in stock or the 10 cast strength, the market has kind of caught up at this point, and there
Yeah.
is some out there.
Yeah, GlenAllachie in the early days, you remember like there was a lot of experimental releases like wine casks and virgin oak, and part of that was them just waiting for enough of these kind of re-racked sherry casks to just become available to them.
Hmm.
Like there was kind of a patience, whereas you can get away with like 18 months in virgin Spanish oak, and you could release that.
Hmm.
And so they were definitely kind of guilty of going overboard. But this lineup I don't mind. Some of the previous ones I was like, do we really need this? But
Well,
this one feels worthwhile.
James, I think that's like the wine, like a lot of the wine cask lines, and I
Totally.
think we know why they were doing them. It's not even just experimentation or trying to show different things to people. It's trying to figure out in a market, especially 2 to 3 years ago for oak, sherry casks keep getting more expensive. They're harder and harder to come by. Like, what alternatives are out there that'll keep people happy? And
Mhm.
there's some of that, but
Well,
yeah,
and to be honest, we're kind of guilty too because people were phoning me and saying, "Hey, like, we'll take any GlenAllachie you've got," and
mhm,
we were then saying to GlenAllachie, like, "Look, we know you don't have any 12 or 15 or 18 or whatever. Like, can we just get something?" And so,
yeah,
you know,
yeah. Well, and the consumer as well. I mean, like everybody, I think, in that whole chain. Well, the 9-year-old Fino is lovely, really growing on me. Some nice fruity tones, a lot of like apple, pear, but also a little bit of darker raisin,
yeah, totally. Yeah,
malty
that
fruit
fruity
notes
character
coming out.
here, like to me, this showcases what GlenAllachie's spirit is like very well.
Yeah. Well, it's a good point. I mean, James, there's a segment of people out there that crave that really dark, heavy sherry. These are a bit more balanced and a bit more nuanced. And
Yeah. And
I
part of that
mean,
is because the spirit they're working with can kind of stand up to it.
but also, I mean, look at the colors here. The colors are not overly dark.
Right. Yeah.
So this is more of a traditional, it seems like that Fino, I would not be afraid to say, has a bit of an old school sherry vibe to it, even though it's young,
Hmm.
in that it's allowing those spirit characters that you're talking to come through. Whereas, a fresh, dark Oloroso cask, seasoned cask might not allow that. It might just completely overpower it.
Yeah.
Good starter. All right, Amontillado. I mean, I know everyone's trying there, but we'll go along and taste this one now. I'll put her up on the screen. And if you're wondering why I'm putting them up on the GlenAllachie website, it's because we don't have any of these first three releases available for sale. We got a small allocation of them. They were sold by ballot, and then we kept a bottle of each in order to be able to put on the tastings that we're having here.
Hmm.
So, James, Amontillado, you touched on this a little bit. It
Yeah, it's really
starts,
just the more mature cousin
yeah.
of Fino. And if anyone's ever had Palo Cortado, I mean, the way that Palo Cortado and Amontillado kind of come along is slightly different, but really, I think for the sake of whiskey, they should be considered the same cask.
Hmm.
So you get the floor character and the oxidized character simultaneously.
Yeah. It's a little sweeter, a little spicier.
Yep.
It
Yeah,
still
but the
has that,
dried fruit shows up, doesn't it?
it does, and it still has that kind of funky tone to it too, which is
Hmm.
nice.
Yeah, I don't know if I tried this blind, if I would identify that or not. With the Fino, like there's something that kind of sticks out where it's like, oh, was there like a musty cask or It's kind of nice knowing that it's Fino so that you can kind of identify that and really kind of zero in on it.
Well, the
Because like
reality is,
if you were served that blind, what would you think about that musty note? You think it was a fault probably, right?
in which the pheno
In the
or in the,
Fino. Yeah, I know.
yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, some people might go down that road. I don't know that I would. I agree with you. I don't know that I would have been able to pick that out as a pheno cask blind,
No.
but largely, James, because we don't see that many. Like,
Yeah.
how many producers are bottling pheno cask matured whiskeys? Very
Yeah,
few.
very few. Well, I think too, a bigger question here is I think likely there's some manipulation at play here because do I think pheno production creates a whole bunch of casks?
Mm.
Like no, because pheno would you normally would mature in like the oldest, most neutral wood.
Yeah.
So something's been done here a little bit like purposefully for the sake of seasoning purposes.
But I mean, depending on the scale of this project, James, they could also be casks where they paid a bodega to actually
Yeah,
season the
these casks
cask
might
with
not be
pheno.
from their regular kind of chain because they do have
Yeah.
3 or 4 different wood suppliers.
Yeah.
I mean, those sherry casks from Miguel Martin, of course, are what everybody associates, but
Yeah.
yeah, it could be, they have an Eastern European wood supplier. Like there's more than one.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, the other interesting note there, I mean, and you know wines better than I do, so correct me if I'm wrong, but like I always find it funny that people talk about Pedro Jimenez, the grape, when to my understanding, even like doesn't Oloroso use Pedro Jimenez as well, but it's the way they use the juice.
So almost all sherry is made with a grape called Palomino,
Hmm.
which is a grape that you would never use for wine because it's basically flavorless.
Hmm.
It's like the most neutral, but it has high acid.
Hmm.
So as it turns out, it's very well suited for this like process driven wine where you kind of have a blank slate and all the flavor can develop from the process. Whereas Pedro Jimenez is actually a different grape that naturally, in
Hmm.
fact, PX Sherry kind of is a window into if they were growing other types of grapes that actually had more flavor to them, the
Yeah.
direction that you'd go, right? You get much
Hmm.
more like flavor development, you get the sweetness.
Oh, so I mean, it's funny you talk about that low flavor, high acidity, because you could be talking about like full blanche as well, which is what they use to make cognac, or at least one
Yep.
of the principal grapes
Very,
for
very
cognac.
similar profile, you could argue. Yeah.
Mhm. Interesting. Okay. All right. Did you talk about Oloroso? I can't remember when we
Yeah, I mean Oloroso is a sherry that never develops floor, and the way that it is fortified kind of ensures that. So you right away are getting the oxidative character. Now it's protected from spoiling
mhm,
because it's fortified, but you right away get this oxidation. So basically the development of these like rich long chain sugars that give you those like spice characteristics, develop lots of color and
mhm,
give you that dried fruit flavor,
mhm.
more nutty raisins. Yeah, you can always recognize Billy Walker's flavor and tasty notes when he says things like layers of coffee beans and sticky raisins. That's
Sultanas
yeah, so
crop up a lot. Um, so what's interesting there with the Oloroso then is like it effectively it's a very similar style to port, like where you're
yeah.
taking it, but are they allowing some of those sugars to be consumed before they fortify it?
Yeah, good question. With Oloroso, to be honest, usually all of them. It's
Hmm.
usually fermented dry. Now, not in 100% of cases. So it does differ from port in that way. And of course, the grape base, the Palomino grapes, like they don't have any pigment or tannin,
Hmm.
which the pigment and tannin obviously introduces whole new elements. So yeah, it's most Olorosos are fermented totally dry. So the sweetness that you get is more of just an implied sweetness from the caramelization of the maturation.
Hmm.
So, yeah, and there are wines that are like that. Right? Like to be honest, even sometimes you can drink a dry Oloroso and you might think it's sweet because of
Hmm.
that richness and the nuttiness. But yeah, again, it's something you have to almost look up. It's a case by case thing. It's a good
Yeah.
question actually in the sherry business itself and the whiskey seasoning in particular. Like it does beg the question how much seasoning sherry is being left sweet and how much is dry. I
Yeah.
don't know the answer to that.
Well, and I mean, if you think about it from a cost perspective, you're probably going to want it dry because you're going to want most of the alcohol to be created from the juice and not from what you add to it, because that's just another
Yeah.
input cost.
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
Well, but then James, I guess that also, and this is something I hadn't really thought about until we started talking about this. It begs the question about the range, because so much of what we talk about as sherry and whiskey is not sherry made in the way that drinking sherry is made,
Yeah.
but sherry wine used simply for seasoning the casks.
Yes. Yeah, probably to be honest, like I mean, you and I have both worked in this business a long time. We've, been to the bodegas, we've done all like sherry and whiskey is a complicated topic. It just is. Did we lose Andrew? Oh,
No, I just had to turn my monitor off for a second.
yeah, no
Um,
worries. Yeah, sherry and whiskey is a complicated topic. I think it's it's easy for us to be reductive about it, to make it easier to understand, but um yeah, probably the best article on whiskey and sherry was in do you remember in the Whiskey magazine puts out an annual every year?
yeah,
Yeah, there was one that their main editor, what's his name? Chris Columbus, something like that.
yeah, I know, I
Forget
know,
now.
I know who
He
you're
had a
talking about.
Yeah, he had a great article on sherry casks about 2 years ago where he kind of like exposed some of the truth about some of this stuff and how a
Yeah.
lot of it's been happening this way for a lot longer than people think.
Well, yeah, I mean, it would have to, because just the volume of
Yeah,
casks required is just not possible to produce them
yeah.
with the volume of sherry that's drank. And I mean, James,
Yeah, and there wasn't that much sherry drank even in the 60s and 70s.
because that's sort of my point with these three whiskeys. The first two actually taste like old school sherry. The third one, it tastes like we're back to that modern
Yeah,
sherry seasoned cask profile.
yeah.
And that might not even be true. Like they might have truly tried to get casks seasoned with proper sherry. As Sammy pointed out, there's a great one on
Oh
SMP
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Glass.
That's worth a watch as well. Well,
Uh,
I do have some insight on this because I remember when we did work with GlenDronach and Stuart, of course, who was the brand ambassador, he had some insight on this. So he basically explained that at Miguel Martin, part of the secret to the cask they've always gotten is that Miguel Martin does make some brands of sherry
mhm,
that are released commercially. So specifically, I remember he sometimes had the bottles with him, and they were like grocery store brand. It was a PX and an Oloroso, and allegedly at the time, I mean this is 10 years ago, but they were being sold at grocery stores in Germany. But the point was is that this was like actual sherry that had been given time to actually develop and oxidize.
mhm.
So that's why these casks were so good, is because they weren't really just necessarily being seasoned.
Well, I think what we've not told people, but I think is sort of slowly being explained to them, is that most of the industry relies on these speed seasoned sherry casks, which will have sherry in them for 3 to 6 months, maybe more if you're lucky. You know, some better producers like Gordon MacPhail will leave them longer.
Yeah,
And
they're
I've
3 to 3.5 years, which I think is the longest in the industry.
yeah, and I've been to James, I've been to some of these bodegas, like the really big ones, the really big producers. And it's like you're going into one of those endless server farms or,
Yeah.
library, like, archives where they just go on forever because the volume of casks their seasoning is enormous. And that liquid gets recycled. Like it doesn't just season one cask, it'll season multiple
Oh
casks
yeah.
before it's dumped out.
Well, some of this stuff, Stephen Rankin, we actually got on this topic one night last weekend, and he made it sound like even though Paxaret is no longer legal, like some of the reuse of product and stuff, you could argue is not that different from using
No,
Paxaret.
no, it isn't. Anyway, those are lovely. In my heart of hearts, I want to believe that these are bodega sherry seasoned casks where the liquid was bottled and then sold on to a happy consumer at somewhere in the chain.
Yep.
But we'll never know. Um, you know, James, I remember when I started in the business like 21 years ago, like we would sell, and I forget what it is, what was like Bristol, like what was that dirt cheap
Yeah,
sherry,
Harvey's Bristol Cream.
Harvey's Bristol Cream, and we'd go through a case of it a week. I don't think we've had it in the store for more than a decade, and it shows how consumer tastes change over time. But the industry
Yeah,
has
it's
to
only
get
for
clever.
bartenders now, right? They use it to make some of those 100-year-old cocktails.
Oh, there you go. Well, maybe we got to bring it back for the hipsters.
Yeah.
Uh, 12-year-old James. This is not, we'll go on to the 12-year-old. This is not the 12-year-old that's around these days. I almost don't even
No.
put it up on my site or like on the screen because I don't have the 12-year-old because this goes back what, 5, 6 years now?
Yeah, this was the very first shipment that came out that they released. In fact, I think this was the first product that they bottled under Billy Walker. This is one of those bottles. So after the 12 kind of we realized was going to shift and become more of a heavily sherried expression, I went out and snagged a few of these old 12s from the shelf because I knew eventually like people wouldn't believe that this had once been the case. And you can kind of imagine what happened here is, that first wave was a 12 and an 18 and a 25, and they were all kind of this color, even the 18. And it was because they were put together with what was on hand, which was, yes, was there some good bourbon barrels on hand? For sure. And was there some, maybe second or third fill sherry casks that had some good character? Yeah. So, but that's the extent of this. Was there a little bit of virgin oak seasoning? Absolutely. Like short term.
Here, I had to go to Whiskey Base, James, to find the OG
Yeah.
GlenAllachie 12-year-old, but here we go from way back in 2012. So I don't know if you remember this.
Yep.
I'm sure we've talked about it at prior tasting. I was at GlenAllachie when Billy was vatting this, but I think he was also vatting, it was either a 21 or a 25-year-old.
It would have been the 25.
Yeah, I got a
Yeah, they
chance to
did
try it.
five vattings, I think, of the 25.
Yeah, I got to try it before it was even finished because it
Cool.
was they didn't even have a visitor center. They barely had an office. I think they'd been running the distillery for a month or two, but he was already in the process of teeing up those very first bottlings,
Yeah.
which was really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it took them a long time. It took them a
Yeah.
long time. I know there was months at the beginning of just tasting casks.
Now, James, has this been bottled enough to start talking about old bottle effect yet or not? Maybe just a faint touch of it.
It, yeah, I wouldn't, I know what you mean. I would say probably yes.
Hmm.
I mean, it's more than 5 years, right?
Yeah. We tell people like because it's the easiest explanation. When you buy a whiskey, it's inert. It stops aging as soon as you take it out of the cask. But there is an effect on the whiskey as it's in the bottle, as it's sitting in there. Like even
Mhm.
if you don't open it, there's a very slow oxidation that takes place, depending on each individual cork and how good a seal it is. But yeah, I mean that's not. I mean that tastes like, and I don't mean this in a negative way. It's got a lovely profile, but it tastes like generic Bayside whiskey, like a mix of bourbon and sherry.
Yeah. That was always the way that this bottle was. Like it was, I think I've told this story to you before. Like people weren't excited when we showed this to them.
Mm-hmm.
And
Because they wanted Glendronach 15 circa 2015.
yeah, I mean, even so making that connection initially was very difficult. Um, so yeah, I think like about a year in, because it was more than a year that we had only this type of product available.
Mm-hmm.
And like the company, we were actually talking about like, do we even stick it out with this brand? Like,
Yeah.
there was just no like the packaging, say what you will about the old packaging, but I'll tell you right now, 99% of people's initial reaction to it was not positive. Even if some people now are like, oh, they shouldn't change it.
Was it the Flintstone effect?
I don't know.
Yeah. Like you go back to the letters, and
Yeah,
that
people
they,
very much thought that it was a Flintstones font that had been kind of like downloaded on someone's computer and
well, I mean, you don't think about these things unless you're like maybe artistically minded, but like the background on all those labels was stone because
Mhm.
GlenAllachie, what is it, Valley of the
Yeah, I
Rocks?
mean Valley of the Rocks in Gaelic, and of course, as you might imagine, this sign comes from they commissioned someone to make a kind of a stone marker at the entrance.
Mhm.
And did he subconsciously like think about, this type of a font and kind of work backwards from that? Like probably. And then they kind of just went ahead and copied it.
Yeah. There's something very cognac-like about that GlenAllachie 12-year-old. Like it almost reminds me of like a young VSOP or maybe even young XO in terms of the flavor profile.
Yeah.
Quite
Yep.
grapey.
Yeah, it is grapey. Yeah, and I wouldn't fight you if, if someone was ever to describe GlenAllachie single malt as like almost having like Welch's grapefruit kind of character. Maybe not that specific like purple flavor, but like just the way that it drinks.
It's a touch of Hubba Bubba.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. It's, you know what? It's a very pleasant whiskey. I, I think for me, my palate was wowed a little bit by the Fino and the Amontillado, especially. And so this is, yeah. I guess to be fair, James, you can see why maybe people weren't as excited about this because, you know, if you're looking for that, and I mean, I don't necessarily just look for that sherry profile. It's not really that. And, you know, if you've still got wax of Billy Walker era Glendronach, then that's probably not the most exciting release to you. But
Yeah.
is it a well-made whiskey? Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's well made.
Well, and let's be honest, it's like, if you followed Ben Reek from the beginning and some of the strange things that were released from there at the beginning, it's very much in that vein.
And lots of Latin.
Yeah, thankfully, yeah, they ditched the Latin, but instead went with the goofy stone carved label. So good for them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thankfully,
Yeah.
they have since hired people to create the new packaging and the Meikle Toir packaging.
Yeah.
So
You know, and I think, you know, as consumers and retailers, you know, you get used to certain things. I'm one of those people who generally doesn't love rebranding because I think, you know, you get used to something, you're used to recognizing it, you're used to seeing it, and then when they change it on you, it's kind of jarring. And
yeah,
uh,
it's against human nature.
but yeah, this is what GlenAllachie 12 looks like these days, and the color is definitely darker, like this sort of approximation
Yeah.
here on the screen.
Well, and it's interesting because what GlenAllachie 12 has become, and like it's just a super fruity, easy drinking, just it's a bowl of fruit and fun.
Hmm.
Like that's what GlenAllachie 12 is.
Hmm.
It's like it's not like a super serious whiskey at all, but it's been made that way on purpose.
Hmm. Shall we on to the 15? I'm not trying to
Yes.
rush things along here,
It
but
looks enticing, doesn't it?
yeah, and I'm not sure I shared the link there for the 12-year-old, but I will.
Now, I will
I'll
say
put
I
that.
was working the GlenAllachie table at Banff, and it's amazing how many people, of course, have still never tried this. Like the majority of people that come to the counter have never tried it. And seeing people's initial reactions to this whiskey is so fun.
Hmm.
Because I don't think there's another whiskey like this on the market. And that's including the other sherry bombs that are out there like Tamdu and,
Hmm.
make your list. Like this one just has its own thing going on.
Yeah. All right. Putting the 15 up here, James. So we've not seen too much of this for a little while now.
Mhm.
In the last 3 to 4 months, finally, you know, we don't have to hoard it and ration it quite the way we did before.
Yep.
Still limited, but not quite as limited as it was.
It is slightly less limited. It's amazing how a slight downturn in the market and just a slight increase in production
Hmm.
has solved that problem. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, definitely a preponderance of Oloroso and like first fill Oloroso and first fill PX here.
Hmm.
Each batch would vary a little bit. I definitely noticed that this first batch in the new packaging, which I believe is what we're drinking tonight, like it's even more GlenAllachie 15-ish than even some of the previous batches.
James, would you describe this as dumpy?
Yes,
Seems
100%.
quite dumpy.
Yeah, it is. Like it's just lush. Like
Hmm.
it to be honest, it reminds me of kind of the popular styles of red wine in Alberta where you get and to be fair, like we sell one with Massey with Amarone, right? Like it's very, very lush,
Yeah.
lots of like bursting fruit at the front of your mouth,
Yeah.
and then it just like finishes soft.
It's a hard wine not to enjoy. It can be a
Yeah.
bit much if you're trying to
Well,
take down a whole bottle.
yeah, there's this funny characteristic too where those of us that all, if you have even a little bit of nerd in you, like you kind of like won't allow yourself the pleasure of just enjoying this on a hedonistic level,
Mhm.
you almost like in your brain, you're like, oh no, I have to downscore this because it's too sexy. Like it's not
Mhm.
serious. So
Mhm.
I can't say that I love it.
You know what, I think that for a lot of like wine experts, they probably
That's
feel that
definitely a
way
thing.
about they feel that way about port as well. And then you
Sure.
sit them down and work them through it, and then they're like, yeah, wow, this is actually like some of these are actually pretty spectacular.
Yeah.
But it's because it's such an unusual style and it is decadent and a bit of an indulgence. And, it's not a wine that's struggling to like express itself. So they kind of feel a need to like look down on it a little bit, even
Yes.
though when it's great, it can be incredible.
Oh, I know. I follow a few like meme sites that are like that make fun of wine through memes on Instagram. And like every second joke is making fun of wines from Paso Robles. And it's for that reason, right? It's like you're not
Yeah.
allowed to like them
Right.
because they're too fun.
Yeah.
GlenAllachie 15 is for sure in that category.
Yeah. The palate, it's dark, chocolatey, rich, some nice layers of tobacco in there. Uh, you know, festive spices. It's got a nice balance to it. It's elegant. I mean, you compare it to that early 12. I didn't want to say it too much because, I didn't want to downplay it, but there's a spiritiness to it. Like it's almost there's a
Yes.
faint sharpness, and
Yes.
there's none of that in the 15.
Yeah. Yeah, and has it been a little bit washed over? I mean, maybe.
Yeah.
I think it helps to appreciate this more if you still kind of have the memory of GlenDronach 15, those original ones, which those were sherry bombs, but you could taste underneath them, and you couldn't as much in the 12. In the 15, you could. There was like this earthy kind of like, you know, almost like bark mulch or like wet earth kind of character underneath the sherry. And if you knew enough about GlenDronach, you knew that that was like the nature of GlenDronach's spirit, is it kind of was a bit earthy.
Hmm.
And I like that this, like in those same casks, is just showing, like you said, that like grape juice or bubble gum at the front of the palate. Like that's not
Hmm.
the cask. That's GlenAllachie spirit.
Yeah. It's funny. We've done a number of, and James, you don't have to comment on this for political reasons, but like we've done a lot of GlenDronach tastings in recent years, and almost all of them have been a little disappointing because the post Billy Walker era there has not been, I think, as great as the heyday of when he was there and when his group were running the distillery. And it really begs a lot of questions because, on the one hand, you'd think there was this legacy of great whiskeys left behind, but if that's the case, the people there now don't seem to know how to blend and bottle them.
Yeah.
Or, was the pantry left empty and like the best stuff was bottled off before
Yeah,
he.
I think the more likely answer to that question is that, I know how well distributed we were with GlenDronach. Like it was small. Like
Mhm.
even when I started with the company and would go out with GlenDronach, people told me all the time, they're like, my customers won't drink. This is way too much sherry. They're
Right.
like, like this isn't Scotch drinkers don't like this. They like it's too much.
Mhm.
And it was a small niche, right? We didn't sell that much. It was
Mhm.
like I remember visiting the distillery, and when I was there, they were vatting the 21-year-old, and they had pulled out two casks, like two sherry puncheons. There was one Oloroso and one PX, and that was an entire batch of 21.
God,
So, like, do you think that they have that luxury now when they're trying to like
no.
supply all their markets? No, there's probably like 45 casks in a batch. So,
It's an
do I
interesting
think
thought.
that
But
at
James,
least two of those are great quality out of the 45? Almost certainly.
so I guess that also, James, that also makes me feel like I sold to be, blunt, a fuck ton of GlenDronach because we must have gone through 10 or 11 casks
I know.
during the era when they used to do that.
Yeah, well, there were years where we sold more casks, like by bottle of GlenDronach, than we did, if you excluded the 12, than we did
Mhm.
of the rest of the range.
Yeah.
They give us a hard time about it all the time.
You got to give people what they want, though, to a
Yeah,
certain
you have to
extent.
give people
I
what
mean,
they
it's
want.
a fine line. I mean, and a lot of companies don't get that, but they want people to want what they want them to want.
Yeah, that is so true of that is That is the conceit of the whiskey business, is that we can steer you as the consumer, and
Mhm.
it's kind of gross.
But I think we're also starting to see the limits of how far that will go and how long it will work, because now, there's so much choice that maybe that's when demand will start correcting supply, because people will have to
Yeah.
shift to meet demand and give people what
Yeah.
they want.
Yeah, I've heard I think it was like Roy, the Aquavita guy, said something along the lines of, some of these core range bottlings from the basic distilleries are for sure going to get better because they're going to make them smaller.
Yeah.
They're going to make the batches smaller.
Yeah, that's a very interesting and hopeful perspective.
Yeah.
Hopefully those brands will survive
Yeah.
that transition, because I think, you saw that too in it. You see that, the build up to peak whiskey, if we've hit or passed it yet, I'm
Oh,
not
we've
sure.
definitely passed it.
Well, I don't know that we've hit peak supply. We've hit
Mhm.
peak demand.
No, we've hit peak demand.
I
Correct.
think peak supply comes after peak demand.
Yeah.
And then it'll be interesting to see how peak supply responds to the fact that demand has peaked and is maybe hopefully not declining, but finding, some sort of equilibrium. But yeah, what do people do? Like, how do they start rewarding people to win back their business?
Yeah. Good
So
question.
yeah, Sasha commenting Waterford shutting down. Not the first, I believe.
Yeah, let's be
Penderyn in
honest.
Wales shut one of their
There's going to be a lot of
distilleries
those
down.
stories in the
Yeah,
next 24 months, unfortunately.
yeah,
A lot.
yeah.
Yeah,
But
not one or two more, but 15 or 20 more,
yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah, and that's the reality is 40 odd new distilleries in a decade in Scotland, and more that are still, for some strange reason, under construction.
Yeah.
Um, I've said to people who are planning to build distilleries, why don't you just wait for someone to go bankrupt and buy them out? Because that's going to
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah. Save yourself all that money.
Yeah, buy it up at a fire sale price. Anyway,
Yep.
uh, GlenAllachie 18, James, 18
Yeah,
year old.
this is a soft spot for me. Absolutely. I've loved every batch of this. And this one in particular, I think shows some variation batch to batch. But I've got to say this first in the new packaging, I think is the best that they've bottled for sure. It's a nice counterpoint to the 15 because even though it has as much sherry and the recipe is very similar, they don't go quite as like fruit and cherry bomb in the character. It's a little bit more serious,
Mhm,
which of course was kind of similar to the way that Glendronach 15 and 18 interacted.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, you see that, like, you build up to the 15, and then the 18 sort of becomes a little bit more subtle, a little bit more elegant,
Yeah.
not
Yeah, there's more
as
of those like leathery and earthy notes in it.
so James, this does, and I'm just noticing on here we're sold out of this.
Hmm.
Um, is it sold out in market right now, or is there more coming?
There is more coming. There's more on the water. We do kind of expect like this used to be something that you kind of had to win a lottery to get,
Mhm.
and it was just in stock in your store, I think, for over a month.
I think it
So
probably the last bottle must have sold within the last week.
yeah, I know that actually I had two retailers call me that someone and I'm sure it was the same customer had cleared out like the last three or four bottles that they had. So I think this again, this batch in particular, this 2024 batch, it's a benchmark for this
Mhm.
because it has a lot more kind of a three-dimensional feel than previous batches. They've all been
Yep.
good. I mean, the price of these is really fair,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
like it's a true sherry bomb this time. But again, it has that backbone to it.
Yeah, the sherry notes are there. There's like a surprisingly like a bit of a minerality to it, which I wouldn't expect from a whiskey this old with a sherry, but it's got this kind of chalky, I don't know, like
Yeah, that minerality note is interesting. It is something that you sometimes pick up in GlenAllachie. Sometimes it's hard to pick it out because the sherry's so heavy. I also think the fruit qualities are kind of a little bit more broad. Like there's kind of a little bit of almost like a like an overripe cantaloupe kind of flavor. Maybe it's a touch tropical.
Yeah, it is starting to go tropical on the palate for sure. Um, like
Like
there is
it to
this,
me, it really smells like overripe cantaloupe.
well, maybe that's what I'm getting on the nose, James, is that it reminds me of like citric hand soap.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah. It's an interesting. You're right. Like there's that mineral kind of floral character that kind of sticks out.
mhm. The palate, elegant, soft, lots of leather and tobacco.
Yep. Yeah, leather and tobacco for sure.
Little less, kind of a little less sweet fruit than the 15. Um, the chocolate, like if I were to describe it, the 15 is kind of more of a milk chocolate. The 18 is more of a dark chocolate in terms of profile.
The other thing too, like the spice and even the alcohol is a little bit more spiky, but
Mm,
I kind of think that that's like well placed. Like it kind of suits it. Like it
yeah.
needs a little bit of that.
Mhm. Yeah. Would you say it elevates it just a little?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Elevate, that's a very popular word these days. We're all supposed to elevate people's experiences.
Well,
Long finish to it. Um, you know, it's great, but I seem to remember we tried a different batch of GlenAllachie 18 a year or two ago that I think I liked even better because it
yeah, I
was a
know
bit
exactly
more
which
old
one
school.
it is. It's the 2021.
Yeah.
And it's funny you say that because I actually poured a sample of the 2021 to have beside it here.
Mhm.
And
Oh,
they're similar in that they're both a little bit more fruit forward than other batches of 18.
yeah.
But
You're making me go look, James, to see if I've got it, but I
yeah, the batch that you're talking about is this is the batch,
mm,
and it is bottled on April 5th, 2021.
mhm.
And that's the one that we did that tasting with Ronan, and he said that he thought it was the best whiskey they had produced so
Yeah.
far, which I thought was like a pretty bold thing to say.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because it's got the fruit, but it's not. It drinks quite soft and elegant. Like
Mhm.
it doesn't have a lot of the spice and chocolate the same
Well, I
way.
think it's that's that older
Yes.
school style sherry that I personally really love. Um, that yeah, it's harder and harder to find that, which interestingly, I'd say even though it's not quite as dark or rich, going back to that Fino is the closest thing I think in this range to
Yeah.
that, even though it's not quite as dark.
Hmm. Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, tasty stuff. All right, James, I think it's time for something completely different.
Yeah, which I just went to. I
You're already a step ahead of us.
am a little bit. Woo.
I love how like I just wanted to see what they had on their site for Meikle Toir, but like you have to go to a completely different website for Meikle Toir.
Yeah, they've really tried to separate it. And to be fair, like it doesn't have a lot in common. The two products are fairly divergent.
Except both websites have an introductory video.
That clearly was made by the same person at the exact same time.
Yeah, here we go. I'm gonna click on it while you're talking, James. So James, tell us about Meikle Toir.
Yes. So Meikle Toir is a fun side project that was launched in those early days. So when Billy took over, part of the job was not just dealing with the cast, but also getting the stills fired up again, and specifically, figuring out like what is the future of GlenAllachie. Like they've wanted to preserve the character that of the spirit that they had, but they also knew there was a lot of room for improvement because I mean, GlenAllachie's last year they produced over 4 million liters of spirit. That's a lot. So just the simple character of slowing down the stills, not running the stills hot, slowing the fermentation down. I think a lot of the talk has become about the fermentation because it went from like under 50 hours to over 150.
Which is
Um,
like that is a dramatic change in
Dramatic change.
profile.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, yeah, part of that is, of course, to try to create more complexity and a better quality spirit. But truthfully, I know a lot of the reason is that Billy has this thing he hates when spirit bubbles into the neck of the still, and longer fermentations really kill that. And his feeling is that some of those bubbles create like a charring effect and create some bad impurities in the spirit. And I think with GlenAllachie having those descending line arms, they felt that was an issue. So that they kind of forced. Now, you can't do fermentations this long everywhere. Part of the secret to how they do this is a lot of the wash that they're making is it's more like a commercial modern craft brewery. Like it's clean.
Hmm.
So the fermentations are not like, if you've been like to me the opposite is Brook Laddie, right? It's like open top, this old wood. The tanks stay empty sometimes, so that's got to like affect what's going on in there. And you get this kind of like lactic and like some of these funky cheesy notes.
Very funky.
Yeah, GlenAllachie's like the opposite of that. It's like a clean stainless steel washback that has been like, you know, the spirit. There would for sure be some contamination, but it would be minimal.
Mm.
And anyway, so of course, as one does, they tried some peated malt. And one of the things they discovered is that the kind of intensely fruity character of GlenAllachie kind of soaks peat. So they kept raising the amounts. And really where they ended up um, in the official trials here was, roughly double the amount of peat that you would use in a typical Isla whiskey.
Hmm.
And yeah, there's kind of two reasons why. Number one, you might think like, well, that's insane. Are we talking about Octomore? And in a way, yes, this is a competitor with Octomore for sure. But again, number one, the nature of the spirit kind of soaks and hides that, kind of disguises that peat a little bit more than an Octomore would, than Berglaty. And of course, also the source of peat. Even though Octomore peat also comes from the mainland, the peat that is being used here is the same. I believe it's the same peat that's used at Ben Riach that Billy used back then. It's got a more subtle character. It's not coastal,
Is it
right?
Black Isle Pete from
No, it's not Black
Inverness?
Isle peat. That's a good question. No,
Oh,
this is from near Aberdeen.
okay.
So it's the town of St. Fergus, which is just north of Aberdeen.
Great name. Gotta love that.
Yeah, there you go.
Uh, so James, there's the range, and incidentally, we're not going to do this early this year, partly because we did a Meikle Toir tasting, I think in the spring.
Yeah,
We've included this one tonight. Harmony really wants to do a head-to-head Meikle Toir versus Octomore at some point in time. So
yeah.
at some point in time, that's going to happen, but not before we pit Octomore v Octomore.
Well, what we should wait for is there will definitely be offerings of single casks of Meikle Tour in the market, and that's when we should do that.
All right. We'll put a pin in it, as they
Yeah,
say for now.
yeah.
So James, let's talk about, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Close
Yeah,
that.
we're specifically dealing with the purple one, the sherry cask, because of course this whole thing has been about sherry.
Yeah. So let's go to the sherry one, as they call it. Very, very complex marketing strategy there behind the naming here.
Hmm. Yeah, the name Meikle Tour basically translates to the big pursuit or the aspiration. And yeah, they have explicitly tried to avoid comparison with Octomore and how this is labeled and marketed.
Hmm.
In fact, you'll notice at the end they talk about the amount of peat is 35 parts per million.
Hmm.
I mean, that's misleading because that's the amount in the actual spirit,
Yeah.
which nobody else in Scotland measures peat that way.
Torvig does.
Thank you. That's it, though, isn't it?
I don't know of anybody else who does that, but
Yeah.
Torvig does. Yeah.
So, which that reminds me, I don't have a bottle of Torvig in front of me, but what's the peat is usually like around 10, right? In the spirit?
No, I think it's actually quite a bit higher than that. And
Okay,
you know what, James? I've got a bottle here.
great.
I couldn't find that bloody GlenAllachie 18, but I've got a Torvig here. Only I can get the lid off. Now, this is a cask strength one, so the ABV will have an effect too. But well, maybe it's just on the website. But they do talk about the ppm. I actually think it's closer to 77, bizarrely.
Oh, in the spirit.
I'll have to look that up. But or
Okay.
yeah, I'll have to look that up.
So
Don't
I know that after going through this process, I've had some people tell me that an Isla whiskey would usually be close to 15 parts per million in the spirit, given that the original barley was like 55.
Oh, you know what, James, you're right. Barley was 77 on the Torvig, and it's 17 for the
Okay.
46%
Yeah.
bottling.
Those numbers make more sense.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So you can imagine this GlenAllachie at 35 in the bottle, it probably started in the 100 to 120 range.
Which is about what a lot of the Octomores like.
Yeah, especially like the first couple batches, right? The 1.0s and the 2.0s were more in that range. Now
Mhm.
you see a lot of stuff over 300, but
Yeah. But you know, well, they don't need to do this, James, but you can do it and I can do it. And I don't want to, get in the way of people purchasing Octomore, but I think one of the things about this range that is pretty striking is the fact that you could have three bottles. You could have the
yeah.
full range with the exception of the turbo for the same price as an entry level Octomore.
Yeah, that's a pretty compelling sales pitch to me.
Mhm.
But
Hopefully Remy Cointreau is not watching this tasting.
are you friendly with them now?
Oh yeah, no, we're fine with them. They look after us well, and I'm a fan of Bruichladdich. I love what they do.
Yeah.
But I have said it. I mean, I think the pricing on their Octomores is outrageous. It's hard to justify,
Yeah.
but it is what it is, and people still buy it. So
Yeah, they sure do.
people, although maybe
Yeah.
not as much
Yeah,
as they
strangely, I worked for Berklady at the time that was launched, and much like I have this long history of selling whiskeys that people look me in the eye and are like, "You're an idiot thinking you can sell this." And then they like get popular later, and I'm like, I don't get to like see the benefit of like the downstream effect. So
Mhm.
Octomore was like that. Pouring early Octomores for people with the packaging and the high peat, like you might as well have told them that like the distiller had peat in the tank. Like that's how their reaction was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think peat is still very misunderstood as well with your average consumer.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of people characterize flavors that have more to do with sherry as being peat flavors because they just don't know any better. Like
Yeah.
they associate that earthiness with something else. So um yeah, James, you going back to those 9-year-old sherry releases that we started with.
Yeah, should we do the
Well, no, I'm not sorry, I'm not
okay, okay.
suggesting that, but my point is like going to that 5-year-old, it's remarkable how mature it noses and
Oh yeah.
tastes for
It to be
something
honest, it
just
tastes
5
more
years old.
mature,
Mhm,
arguably, than the first three.
mhm,
Yeah, and like we should add that their plan was not to like let's rush a 5-year-old heavily peated out the door. That wasn't the plan at all.
mhm,
So the early casks of Meikle Toir, which before it even had a name, and before they had like an official tour or a gift shop, if you went and toured, of course, like very typical, they would bring you into the barrel cellar and they always would save these like 2 or 3 year old casks of Meikle Toir for the end of the tour
mhm,
because it was kind of this like wow factor and they realized like that they had struck something. And it was getting to that age 3 or 4 and people were telling them like if you bottle this, I would buy it right now.
mhm.
And they were like, well, maybe we should, maybe we should release it when the phenols are high.
Right. But I think James, that is again, even for people who like peat, something that's not well understood because and I have a customer, he's been a friend for almost 20 years now. He loves young Ardbeg and he's a man with means and he'll go out and buy the Ardbeg 25 when he sees it and he's always disappointed. And every time he tells me about this, I tell him it's because he likes that young, raw, intense,
Yeah, he would probably like this whiskey.
yeah. And what he doesn't appreciate, and he still can't wrap his head around this, is that older and more expensive is not going to please his palate more
No.
than that young, raw Yugadale because that's what he likes. And
Yep.
over time, that mellows and fades and becomes softer. So, yeah, it's funny that they were not thinking about that because if the whole point was to produce something intensely peaty, 5 years is probably the perfect
It's
point at which
the
to
magic
bottle
number. I mean, maybe eight, but five is a magic number.
it. Yeah, it works
Yeah.
well. And
But yeah, there'll be some great old Meikle Tours that come down the pipe, right?
mhm.
Like one day on one of these tastings, we might drink Meikle Tour 25, but it's not going to taste anything like this.
James, that'll be just before my semi-retirement, I suspect. But yeah,
Maybe it'll say the Kensington Wine Market 50th anniversary.
there you go. Single cask.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, it's lovely. The last thing about peat, I'm sure most of you know this as well, is um, God, I lost my train of thought. I don't even know where I was going to go with that. It had something to do with peat and age, James, but it doesn't matter. It may come back to me or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. Now we should say there is exceptions. I mean,
Yeah.
like I remember we had that remember that Kalila that was like 20-ish years old from Gordon MacPhail. It heavily sherried,
hmm
and the peat was really strong.
Yeah.
So who knows?
It's not an exact science. There's a
No, it
bit of
definitely isn't.
magic and time and casks and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Shall we on to our speed rounds?
Yes.
Go back to the GlenAllachie 9, make our way through.
Yes. Oh, it's a lot more honey than I remember, which
Mhm.
isn't that a common thing of this style of whiskey when it sits in
Yeah.
glass?
Yeah. It just becomes a little bit sweeter. The
Mhm.
fruits are still there. It just smells really, really soft.
Yeah, it comes across soft now after going through the rest of that lineup for sure.
Um,
Yeah, I really like that though.
it's fruit leather, spices. It's elegant. And you know what, James? That actually, I think, has almost the most tropical tang of anything on this tasting so
Yeah,
far.
I agree. Although watch out for these for that 15 as it sits in the glass.
Yeah. Okay. 9-year-old Amontillado.
Yeah, a little bit nuttier than I remember. The funk actually on these first two kind of I feel like has diminished.
It has. I think it held on the palate a little longer on the Amontillado.
Yeah,
It's nutty, it's dry. Um, it's almost got like a cheesy funk to it too.
yeah.
Okay, lovely.
Okay.
9-year-old Oloroso. You're gonna want to hang in here because we're gonna tee up the vote shortly, and we'll see if Evan has prepared a cheeky third and or fourth question for the lineup. And it looks like he has.
You know what you notice on this Oloroso this time around is that like Welch's juice flavor that I mentioned. You can see it creeping in, can't you?
Yeah.
Like that is such a GlenAllachie hallmark.
You know what also reminds me of, have you ever tried the sediment from an old bottle of port?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
reminds kind of like a dry
Yes. Yes.
jelly sort of note.
Yep. I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, that's fun. All right, GlenAllachie 12. That still smells like young cognac to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean I still want more out of that if I'm being honest, but
Mhm.
it's certainly a whiskey that maybe didn't quite deserve the fate that it had, which was like discounting to get rid of it.
It's for what it is, it's lovely. I mean, as I said before, and don't mean this in a negative way, like a generic Speyside style whiskey at 12 years of age, I think it's very, very decent. But yeah, it's not what people wanted. It's not
No,
what they were looking for.
no, it was not.
Um, all right, the 15. James thinks this is going to be our most tropical. It's definitely like the most syrupy going to the nose.
Yeah. Well, I will say, by the way, having tasted this blind before, I people guess that this whiskey is way older than 15 years sometimes when it's tasted blind.
I can see that.
Because the fruit is just so intense, right? And like what creates that fruit? It's usually the old age.
Mhm. Yeah, nice
Yeah, I
soft
mean
leather.
you can remember when this was more common in younger whiskeys when you get like 12-year-old whiskeys that have this much fruit, but that's not as common anymore.
Very good. Lovely.
Yeah, you don't have to say much about this one, really.
Well, I mean, we are seeing a trend here, and it's in a lot of these, like you're getting that kind of grapey, slightly dumpy sort of sherry note to
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, it's a little bit with, you're making like a peanut butter and jam sandwich and
Mhm.
you accidentally put too much peanut butter and then you just put like extra jam thinking it'll balance it out. That's the philosophy behind the 15.
Yeah.
Okay, you're on the 18?
Yeah, 18 still lovely. It's elegant. I like that slightly toned down sherry, um,
Hmm.
slightly more elegant, balanced profile to it. It's very
Yeah,
tasty.
it's really well made.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the length on the 18 goes like to me is way longer than the 15.
I mean, that's kind of the magic of time, right? Like more
Yeah.
time equals,
Yep,
especially when you're in your teens with whiskey, more elegance, a bit more sophistication. It's very nice.
totally.
I really wish I had that other 18 here to try it side by side with. And the 5 year, the Meikle Toir, we were only there moments ago. This to me is like your archetypal toasted brown bread with peanut butter and like jelly, not jam,
Yep.
but jelly on it.
The yeah, it's interesting. Of the four Meikle Tours, I don't know if you remember this. Obviously, we just have the one in front of us today, but like the peat is toned down a lot in
Mhm.
here especially compared to the original and the turbo. Yeah, but
It's almost GlenAllachie Yuga Ale.
yeah, yeah,
All right,
it's
James,
very March. All right.
we're gonna have to pick favorites in a moment here. I'm gonna fire up the polls.
Mhm.
We've lost a few, but there's still some kicking around. So you've got three questions to ask. The first is favorites. Oh, you know what? Hold on. I'm gonna stop that because I gotta fix it. Because like the list, it listed yeah, I gotta go back. It listed the Amontillado twice. We need to edit it. I wonder duplicate the poll. There we go.
Can we just assume that people will know that the second one is the Oloroso?
Yeah, but it'll only take a minute here. Oloroso. There we go. And second time. Oh, he did it on the second one. It was just the first. So here we
Yeah,
go.
it is the first one.
Yeah. So I'll fire this up. It's saving, launch. Here we go. So first question is your favorites. Second is second favorite. And then the third question is my mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the sherriest of them all? And then Evan has given you some.
Does
Yeah,
Evan just talk like this all the time, by the way?
no, it does make me wonder what he's doing when I'm wanting him to help me with other things. So that is the question that this is raising for me at this moment in time.
He probably literally watched a Disney movie with his kids like
Oh, of
mere
course he did.
hours before writing this.
Of course he did. All right, James, I don't even know where to begin here with my, well, I think I have an idea. To
Yeah,
narrow
it's
it down
tough,
with
I know.
three. Even that Amontillado one is really reminding me of cognac now. All right, I'm gonna put you on the spot. You've probably spent more time with these whiskeys than I have, not
Yeah.
outside of tonight's tasting.
Yeah.
What are your three favorites?
Yeah, I mean I think I would lean to the 18 as my most favorite. It kind of has like a lot of the best parts of all the other whiskeys like all jammed into it.
Mhm.
You could make an argument for the other ones and the argument for those kind of is in the 18. So I would be 18 number one. Then I'm gonna get a little bit controversial. I'm actually gonna pick the 15 as number two. I think that as much as it would be easy to critique this whiskey for some of the goofiness, I also think that this is a complete original, and we should not. I think we would be sad if this went away. Let's put it that way. I'm picking that as number two, and number three for me will be the Meikle Toir. Um, yeah, just again, probably another whiskey that I see people's eyes glaze over when I pour it to them the first time, but long term, I've always said I think Billy or GlenAllachie in the long term will be known more for their peated whiskey than their sherry whiskey. I'm going to stand by that.
Okay, very good. Uh, I'm similar but different. I'm gonna do the 18 as my favorite as well. Really like that. Shows really well. I think the 15 as well is hard to beat. Like it, especially knowing what people are looking for. I think that's a great dram. And then my third favorite is going to be the Fino Sherry. I really like the Meikle Toir, the sherry one. I think if I had an honorable mention, it would be that one. Um, but yeah, the Fino really spoke to me. I really love that dry, fruity,
Yeah.
fresh style that it has. And
Well,
I don't
isn't
see that
that
very often.
if you were ever to say like what's the missing element from GlenAllachie's, it's that like grip on the finish that like balances it out, and that Fino has that.
Mhm.
So yeah, I get that.
All right. So those are our favorites. Let's see what yours are. Everyone's voted. Hurrah. Okay, I'll share the results here. Favorite whiskey of tonight's tasting. I am not entirely surprised by this, but GlenAllachie 18, storm into the front. The Fino in second place, and then in third, the Meikle Toir. So look at that. That's pretty cool. And for second favorite, the 18, followed by the Fino, and
That
then
doesn't happen all
close.
that often in these tastings
Wow.
where the
No.
same whiskey wins first and second.
Oh, and yeah, and the first, both the first and second finished first and second in both votes. So there you go. All right, now here's the question that everyone's really wondering about. Uh, who is the most, or who is the sherriest of them all? And GlenAllachie has toppled Gordon MacPhail, Millstone, and
Wow,
I have to,
crickets for Glendronach.
I have to say, Harvey's Bristol Cream is on there too. Amazing.
Yeah, with the meme font.
Yeah, I absolutely love you know, part of me is like, Evan, this how much time did it take you to conjure this up? But that's a pretty bloody good list. GlenAllachie, Glendronach, you know, cheekily Macallan and Glenfarclas probably should have been on that list. But I love that he has Millstone and Signatory on there as well, because
Yeah.
those are two other companies that do great sherried whiskeys as well. Uh, Fun stuff. Well, James, that was a fun lineup, a great tasting. I kind of thought, and I know you and I were talking about this at the time, I really wanted to put the 30 in there, which would have jacked the price on this tasting up a fair bit. But
We're gonna save it though.
yeah, well, but I think looking back on it now, having done this range,
Yeah, I would have blown all these other whiskeys out of the water.
and I mean, would not have given them,
Yeah, it would have been unnecessary.
yeah, it would have been
Whereas when you
like,
put it beside the 21, you've got a compelling conversation.
yeah.
Yeah.
So this lineup, and I'll give you credit. I mean, I just wanted to pour those three limited editions. I kind of gave you a little bit of carte blanche to pick the rest of the lineup, and I think it worked really well. And I also want to say, I think putting in that earlier 12-year-old
Hmm.
where the sherry wasn't all that forward, I think was a really good idea because it shows you where they were and where they are now. And I think, you know, that really demonstrated what's going on with GlenAllachie and their sherry policy and what we can expect to see in the future.
Yep, that's fun.
Awesome lineup. Well, James, thank you very much for co-hosting with me tonight for this great lineup and your support as always. Thank you everybody for taking part in the tasting. I hope you really enjoyed it tonight. We'll see some of you on Thursday for the first This Is Not an Advent Calendar tasting. I'm really excited. I haven't even opened my box yet, so I'll be cracking this open on Thursday. Until then, everybody, have a good night. If we don't see you again, hope you have a Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, all the best in 2025. And thank you very much, everyone. Have a great night.
Right.
James, thank you again.
Absolutely.